Ready to get going?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to our Using Distance Learning as an Asset webinar. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nalani McCutcheon. I'm the Associate Director of Charter School Authorizing for Osprey Wilds, formerly Audubon Center of the North Woods. And we're excited to be hosting this webinar with my colleague at Osprey Wilds, Emily Porter, who's the Director of Education at the center. So I'm glad to have you all here. This is a webinar format, so we encourage you to use the chat feature for asking questions and providing comments. And Emily and I will be monitoring the chat. There's also a question and answer option too, and if you want to put questions in there, that's fine as well. I'm monitoring both of those. So I hope that most of you were registered before we sent out the YouTube video link for Emily's plenary presentation for students. If you did not receive that, it will be posted, the link will be posted along with a video of this webinar and the notes and the PowerPoint later today or early tomorrow. So you will have access to it. So with that, Emily, I think I will turn it over to you. Thanks so much for coming back. We got rave reviews from your nature journaling webinar 2 weeks ago. So we're really excited to hear more from you about ways we can use distance learning as an asset.
Great. Well, thanks, Nalani, and thanks for the introduction. I'm really excited to be back. And yeah, if you didn't get that video, make sure that you do take a look at it. This webinar kind of came out of the idea of me trying to think about other ways that I could make content to help support classroom teachers. And I had developed that keynote speech for a middle school, actually, that I had done a couple of months ago before everything shut down. And I thought, well, I should just record it and put it out there. So that's for you to use with your students. And I'll talk a little bit more later about how that might fit into your distance learning. But I really wanted to think about ways that we could use this time kind of as an asset for students, and ways that in EE, we sometimes struggle to talk to students about their at-home behaviors. Often we're talking about things at school, but with distance learning, we can kind of see that as an opportunity in some ways to really talk with students about their environmental and ecological habits in the home. So thanks for being here with me again. I hope that this is useful. As usual, my goal is to kind of give you some practical ideas to jump off of. So feel free to use anything that you see here. Consider it yours. And I did want to get started just by thanking a couple of people. We did have a focus group session with some teachers and teacher leaders amongst our charter schools. And I just wanted to give a quick shout out to the folks who showed up and were so helpful with me and were willing to talk with me for an hour of their day, which was super generous of them. And they gave me some great ideas to go off of. And we also talked about their challenges and their struggles and their successes with distance learning. So thanks to these folks for your lovely support. And I really appreciate your time. So some of the things that you see me presenting today has come out of that conversation with them, and I really appreciate them. So thank you to our focus group. And then we'll get started. So our agenda today, we're going to talk about 3 things. I'm going to kind of frame distance learning sort of as an asset, particularly in talking about waste reduction as a topic that you might discuss with your students. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how to frame the topic of waste reduction, especially when talking about distance learning with your students. And then most of the workshop is actually going to be looking at some practical ideas that I had and ways to build lessons or units around this topic as you approach the end of the year, because I know we're really getting down to crunch time here with some of our kids, but I think that this might be an awesome way to either do a last push at the end of the year, or even if you're thinking about fall already, these could be good ideas for fall as well to get your kids on a good start. I will be asking you some questions. So as Nalani said, feel free to put your answers in the chat and we'll read those out. And then if you have any questions for me, I'll kind of be stopping periodically to take questions as well. So don't worry, we'll make sure we get to your questions. So I first want to acknowledge that there are real challenges to distance learning, and I felt like I already knew what most of them were going to be, having been a classroom teacher in the past, but talking with our focus group really highlighted a lot of them for me, in terms of all of the things that you all are facing out there in getting your kids engaged and getting them to participate, and also dealing with difficult home lives and all of those things that come up when we talk about having students at home rather than in a classroom together. And when we're talking about distance learning as an asset, I want you to know that I'm not forgetting the challenges that you all are facing. It is really difficult, and I just want to commend you for continuing to work hard and do professional development like this, and spend your time doing this to increase your skills and to make sure that kids are having a great experience. Um, Having said that, I do want to talk a little bit about ways that we can kind of think about students learning in the home as an asset to us as educators, and what can students do during distance learning that they couldn't do in a school setting. And I think that talking about waste reduction is a really interesting way to think about this, because I know a lot of schools have done waste reduction projects like in their school lunchrooms or in classrooms or things like that, but not really seeing kids carrying those behaviors into the home. Could we kind of flip the script on that? Could we talk about kids' behaviors in the home first, and then eventually when they come back to school, talking about it there as well? So we're really thinking about things like we can access students' data at home more easily, because they're at home all the time. We can think about projects that have increased relevance because the realia, or the real items that we're working with, are coming out of their homes and coming out of their direct experience. Um, their lived experience is more immediate to their learning. You can really just ask them about what's going on at home, or what are you doing during your day, or what is your family like. All of those things are much more present when students are learning in the home. And for students who are particularly emotionally healthy, we can even start to talk about, from an EE perspective, quarantine behaviors as a potential positive, or kind of seeing the silver lining in all of these negative experiences that students are having as well. So when we think about how to access those assets, we do have to do some work with students before we can really think about this home learning as a direct asset. And what we want to think about is, how can we build space for students to share their situation and their feelings with you? How can we allow them autonomy to direct their investigations and learning? And then when we are providing them with projects, providing options and modifications for those projects so that students can engage in a way that works for them. I know a lot of folks were even saying that all of their EE projects were essentially optional, which is totally fine, right? You got to do what you have to do to support your students, but really thinking ahead about how to provide those modifications for them so that if they can't do something, they could do something else that is more accessible to them. So before we really start thinking about talking to students about their daily habits, especially around waste reduction, as educators, we have to think about the challenge donut. And if you've ever been to Osprey Wilds and perhaps taken a climbing wall class, you might already know what the challenge donut is, but I'm going to explain it to you. This is an activity that we do with students to talk about their level of challenge or their level of comfort. So you can see the donut here. The middle of the donut is what we would call the comfort zone. It is very safe and surrounded and protected, but it's not necessarily very satisfying. It's not providing you with a lot of nourishment. Not that a donut provides you with a ton of nourishment, but we'll just forget that for a second. But it is very safe and contained. The part in the middle where the donut is, where we've got all our good sprinkles and our frosting and our dough, is called the challenge zone, or you might also call this the learning zone. This is where students are slightly out of their comfort zone and they're pushing themselves to do something new, to grow or to expand their knowledge or to just try something that they've never done before. And learning or challenge always requires a little bit of discomfort. You're not completely comfortable when you're truly learning. And so we call that the challenge zone. That's the satisfying part, the donut part. But then we also have this third space, which is the worst possible scenario where there is no donut at all. And that's when students are in the panic zone. And we don't want students to be in a panic zone. A panic zone is where students are either so uncomfortable or so afraid that they're not really capable of learning or really doing much of anything besides alleviating that fear or that tension or that discomfort. And I'm bringing this up because when we talk about having students examine their own behaviors and perhaps make changes in their long-term behaviors and habits, we really want them to be in that donut area, that challenge zone area. If they're in their comfort zone, they're probably not pushing themselves quite enough, but if they're in their panic zone, they're really not going to be able to learn anything of substance. So just to practice our understanding of our zones, I want you to, and this is an activity that I do with students, I want you to, in the chat, just type in something for you that would be in your comfort zone. So something that you do that you are very comfortable with, but that you suspect other people might be uncomfortable with. So for example, when I do this with students, I always give the example of, I'm very comfortable handling snakes, but other people, that might be in their challenge zone or maybe in their panic zone for them. So just take a second and Nalani, if you wouldn't mind reading out just a couple of the responses, something that's in your comfort zone for you, but that you suspect would be in the challenge or panic zone for somebody else.
Sewing.
Sewing, yeah.
Playing sports.
Mm-hmm.
Picking up dog poop. That's my comfort zone too. Talking to large groups. Gardening. Camping, writing IEPs, camping again, waking up very early, cooking, gardening, running long distances, painting a room.
That's awesome. So then with students, what I would have them do is, as everybody says something that's in their comfort zone, if we're together physically, we would all move to the zone that best represents how we would feel about that. So for me, like writing an IEP would be in my challenge zone. It's probably something that I could do if I needed to, but I would be a little rusty. I would be a little uncomfortable doing it. Or, waking up really early might be in my panic zone, and the point of the exercise is for people to see that, and for students especially to see that different people are challenged by different things, and panicked by different things and comforted by different things because of their experiences, right? Because of their background and their lived experiences and their cultural background. All of those things create differences in the way that we approach certain activities. But what I want you to think about as educators is we are all in a situation right now with this shutdown and with schools being shut down and with stay-at-home orders and all of these things that are happening with students, that your students are going to be in a variety of these areas just in their ambient level of tension, right? So some students are going to, in their lives, be constantly in their challenge zone, right? They might be facing some difficulties. They might be slightly uncomfortable, having disruptions in their daily lives. They might be having a struggle like being home with their siblings all the time or being home with their families all the time, being cooped up. And so the way that we think about the way that students learn has to really shift a little bit because of that ambient level of discomfort. And you are going to have some students who might actually be in their comfort zone in this situation. They might be very comfortable at home. They might not have too many challenges facing them. They might be very well supported at home, right? And you will probably also have a portion of your students who are in the panic zone, who are in a position where they're not super able to push themselves into much higher levels of learning or personal growth, because they're too busy trying to figure out, you know, their ambient level of stress in their home lives. So we're going to use this framework to really think about what are we able to do with students in terms of looking at their individual habits and their behaviors and pushing them towards individual growth, because we do have to start out just by saying that not all students are going to be in an emotional or an environmental space where they're going to be able to make drastic changes to their lives right now. So before we start talking about behavioral change, we're going to talk a little bit about how to frame our conversation about waste reduction. And as a long-term environmental educator and as environmental educators yourself, you probably understand that eco-friendly behavior has historically been very difficult to encourage. And I just want to spend a couple of minutes kind of getting your take on why you think encouraging people to like reduce their waste or burn less fossil fuels or et cetera, is really difficult to encourage. So whatever you're thinking right now, how would you finish this sentence? Just throw that in the chat. And Nalani, if you wouldn't mind reading a few of those out again, that would be excellent.
It is uncomfortable, in quotes.
Mm-hmm.
Laziness. Change is hard. It's easier to follow status quo. Buy-in from parents, even if students are engaged and on board.
Mm-hmm.
This is working, so why change?
Mm-hmm.
Many of our non-friendly behaviors are easier and more affordable.
Mm-hmm.
It affects how they choose to live.
Mm-hmm.
People find it hard to change. Not all people view the earth in the same way. It is hard to do, but necessary. People like their stuff because people believe they deserve to do what they want.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the last one that's come in is it's hard to find eco-friendly options, especially in the rural areas.
For sure, yeah. So things that are coming up is like, for example, issues of access, different differences in people's backgrounds, right? Your lifestyle or the way that you choose to live might not align with certain goals that the environmentalist movement has. But a lot of what I'm hearing is that, you know, it's difficult, it's hard to change. And that's true, and that's kind of always been true about people. It's always easier to go along with what you already know works instead of having to find something new. But, and something that we're seeing even in science reporting is that this situation has really kind of forced a change on a lot of us. And we're already seeing different effects on the environment because of the ways that we've had to drastically change our behavior. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot because it's a really interesting way to frame it for students. And that discomfort in changing is something that we have to really acknowledge as educators if we are going to talk to students about trying to change their waste reduction behaviors at home, especially when they're in a situation that is already demanding a lot of change of them. But what we really want to make sure we do is we want to frame the act of change in a positive way. As an environmental educator, an outdoor educator, I really want to be sure that I'm not making people feel ashamed of the way that they are now, right? Because as I've always been taught, shame is the only useless emotion. It only makes you fail to act, really. Shame and courage is inaction rather than action. So we want to focus on things like incremental change, like doing one small thing a day, or focusing on what kids could do instead of what they shouldn't do. Looking at things like having kids come up with creative solutions. And we also want to make sure that we're also talking about the systems that are in place that make it difficult to change, and also the inequity that's in place that makes it difficult for students to change their at-home behavior as well. Issues of access, issues of eco-justice, All of those things come into play when we talk to individual students about personal, like, ecological habits. And also to recognize, coming back to our donut, that students are not always well positioned to change their own behavior. So students who are in their comfort zone are much more capable of doing big picture thinking and thinking about systems and inequities and community action and all of those things that we want kids to eventually get to. But students do need to be in a relative state of comfort in order to be able to engage with that kind of level of change. And students who are in their challenge zone are really well primed to do individual growth and to focus on their own fears and goals and goal setting, and all of those things are really great for students who are in their challenge zone. But kids who are in their panic zone, they're going to be really focusing on that retention of their habits and their safety nets and their things that feel comforting to them, that feel every day to them. And so we really have to start by acknowledging that it's okay if kids aren't prepared to be making big changes with their waste reduction habits. And I just want to acknowledge that before we even get into ideas for lessons, because you're going to have kids all over this spectrum. And I want you to kind of be ready for that. But also think about, how could you use kids who are in different points of this spectrum of comfort in different ways in your project-based learning? Like, could you have students who are in their comfort zone taking the lead on certain areas, and students in their challenge zone doing slightly different parts of their project, and students in their panic zone really focusing on things like research or awareness, or things that are less high affect being like high stress situations. So that's really what we're going to kind of focus on when we talk about our practical applications. And so when I had a ton of ideas, and I'm almost a little worried that I had too many ideas, but I always figure it's better to go big, and then you can always pare down. But I want to think about how we engage with students in different zones and different stages of their journey with regards to where they're at right now emotionally and safety-wise with their quarantine situation or wherever they're at with distance learning. So I've been talking for a little while now. I'm going to pause. Nalani, do we have any questions that came up that I could answer now?
We don't have any questions at this point, unless people are furiously typing now that they've got an option to do so.
I'll give you guys just 30 seconds while I take a little sip here in case there's a question that pops up.
It's looking pretty quiet in the chat box.
Sounds good.
So I'll break in if something comes up that I need to jump in for.
Perfect. So I kind of broke these ideas down into 3 steps in our journey to action. And the first step is always awareness of the problem. And that's often where like large environmentalist campaigns kind of focus, is like just building awareness of the issue. And awareness is also the part of the journey that has the lowest affect. It is the least threatening and is the least emotionally demanding of students. Then we can talk about individual growth, people making personal choices for themselves to change their own habits or maybe habits in their family. And then we think about community action. How do empowered people and empowered students work to improve their community or to impact systems that are also perpetuating this behavior that is damaging to our environment? And so when we think about our journey, just to kind of go over kind of what I just talked through, we want to think about awareness, which again is low affect and is really more accessible to students who are in all of those zones of stress or discomfort because it's relatively low affect. We go to individual growth, which is much higher affect. And this is really best for students who are solidly in that challenge zone, either with what you're asking them to do or they're just their general ambient environment. It's much easier to engage in individual growth when you're a little uncomfortable. And then community action, which we're thinking about organized action for changing systems, students looking at their schools or their communities or their city governments or things like that, or systems of capitalism if they're older students, which is not actually as high affect, I think, as individual growth. It could be medium to medium high affect, but is good for students who are either in their challenge zone or in their comfort zone. And so as we're going through the different suggestions that I have for things that you could do with kids, we want to keep in mind, like, who is this best for? What kids could really engage with this type of work? So we're going to start with activities that are about building awareness and thinking about low affect things that you can do with students that will get them thinking about the issue, and that are really good for students kind of no matter where they're at home right now. So the first activity, I got to give a shout out to our focus group again, came out of them. This is concept of doing garbology with students, which is a form of archaeological study where students could, for instance, record the contents of their garbage at home. This could be something that they could just see just by opening the trash can, or they could make a record as they throw things away, like everything that they throw away in a day. They could make a list or take a picture, submit it anonymously, and have classmates examine the trash as like archaeologists to draw conclusions about the inhabitants and thinking about what is there, and then also what's missing from this picture. What do we not know about these folks? And I thought this was a really cool idea because, again, we're thinking about that really accessible and highly relevant realia for students. This is their stuff, and increases engagement in that way because they're dealing with their own daily lives and their own trash, basically. But really also making students aware of what are you throwing away, right? And that could lead you to talking about ways to either reduce that waste or find alternatives to that waste, or even just talking about where is your trash going to go now? And we'll talk about some ideas for that as well. I actually put this at kind of a low to a medium affect because I actually thought about, like, okay, well, why don't I make a picture of my own trash? And then I got really nervous about doing that, and I felt like my stress level went up a little bit. So you might also want to consider that students might feel a little uncomfortable sharing that information with other students. And so that anonymity would be really important as well, and making sure that you actually never reveal whose garbage is whose is something that you might want to consider as well. Another thing that you can do digitally and is really easy, I spent about 10 minutes on Google looking for different virtual tours of waste management systems, and they do exist. You can get virtual tours of wastewater treatment plants, landfills, recycling plants, and the Hennepin Energy Recovery Center, which is just in Minneapolis over here, has their own video about like what they do and why they do it and all of those things. It's like very positive. It would be a really interesting thing to look at, like, what are these folks not saying about the Energy Recovery Center? But to share learnings about different methods of waste management that are happening in students' communities. And you could have them do these individually and then share back on their learning as an individual report, or you could do them as a class and have a class discussion. But there are a lot of resources out there right now, especially for these kinds of virtual tours where you could go and see these things up front. I saw something pop up. Was there a question?
Well, there was a comment that individually they find it amazing how much plastic is in their trash, even when they're trying very hard not to buy things in plastic.
It's true. It's everywhere. It's so ubiquitous, and it's something that you kind of stop seeing after a while. So that garbology activity really helps students like see what they're throwing away every day, and it makes it very real. If you wanted to use the video that I shared with you all, that video really goes into depth about specific objects and some what I would call high impact objects in waste management or waste reduction. And you could show students that I talk about cell phones, plastic bottles, and food in that video. And you could build off of that by having students find their own high impact object and really do some research about the ways that that particular object is harmful to the environment. Like I kind of talk about, like, you know, little facts like, I mean, we don't recycle, but we throw away like 35 billion plastic bottles a year. So having them find that kind of information and present their objects to their classmates can really help them think through different alternatives that they could use, or the ways that small choices in their day, like to buy a plastic bottle of water as opposed to using a reusable water bottle, really makes an impact overall, and builds on those things. So if you haven't watched that video yet, that video really focuses on different ways that objects use resources and what it means when we throw them away in terms of our overall impact on the planet, just to get students thinking about things that they interact with in their daily lives.
Emily, so we also have a comment that's a compliment to your video.
Oh.
There's a good TED Talk about waste, zero waste life. So.
Oh, nice. You could use your classroom platforms to do class data collection. I think that this is a great opportunity to have students do measuring at home. And I would really encourage you actually to have students as a class like come up with their own way to measure garbage, because not all students are going to have a scale or like a numerical way to measure their garbage. But you could come up with like, how many bags are you taking out a day, or how many platefuls of food did you throw away, right? Or how many handfuls, or thinking about coming up with a less numerical form of measurement, something that anybody could do anywhere. And then recording that data either through a daily Google form, which would be super easy to set up through your Google Classroom if that's what you're using, or a survey through Schoology that would collect that data daily. And it wouldn't necessarily matter if every student participated every time, because you could get enough data over time that you could get actually a significant sample and then analyze their just baseline data, right, without having them make any changes, and then use that data to develop class goals or individual goals for reduction moving forward. But I think that you could make some really cool graphs and get some really interesting numerical data out of students while they're at home, because it's something that would be much easier for them to do and to remember. They have that more accessible prompt with that distance learning situation. And I'll talk a little bit more about how you could do this cross classes as well when we talk more about community action too. And then the last awareness idea I kind of thought of for a distance learning situation was a home audit. And depending on how old your students are, you know, you could do different things that you want them to look at. They could just look at like garbage or waste amounts or what's going in the trash, but you could also have them look at like how many appliances are in your home that use electricity. And for older students, figuring out how much energy those appliances draw every day. But also really focusing on like using students' families as a resource, because they probably have a little bit more access to their family. That might not be true for all of your students, but for some of them for sure, they're going to be interacting with their family more, and talking about like, what did their parents, or how do their parents reduce costs at home? Like, what do things cost? What is the electricity bill like? Are you doing anything to like help keep our electricity bill down, mom and dad, or mom and mom, or dad and dad, or whatever their families look like, or what their parents grew up seeing or learning about waste reduction at home. We often find that you know, families from different backgrounds have totally different ideas about what waste reduction looks like, and it would be really interesting for students to really talk to their families about what their families are actively doing to reduce their waste already, because often that can be invisible to students in ways that they might not understand that their parents are already engaging in. So those are things about awareness. We're gonna talk a little bit about individual growth, but I did want to take a second to pause and just take any questions if any folks had questions about those specific things. I kind of went through a ton of stuff very quickly there. Sounds like no.
Well, you know, it takes a little time to type too. So. At least for me, I finally get my comment typed once everybody's moved on. So
It's true.
it feels a little quiet. I'll break in if something pops in. Oh, wait a minute, here we go. Could interview teachers too instead of families. I think that's a great idea.
Nice. That's a great modification. Thank you for that.
Especially when students may have access to many support professionals that are also checking in with them. So,
very true. Yeah, any adult would work for sure. So, if we're thinking about our waste reduction journey, so one aspect of that journey is just talking about awareness. And if that's all that you guys do with your students, I think that that's great. You know, awareness is really important, and thinking about where your students are right now emotionally, and what they're really capable of doing. Doing awareness is awesome. If you feel like you can push them further, or if there are particular students who are in that challenge zone, who are capable of being challenged and doing that individual growth, I have some ideas for like individual growth things that students could do in terms of making incremental changes in their lifestyle. So if you're doing a nature journal, call back to our last session, this is a great thing to use that journal for, like a daily habit journal. And just thinking about them recording the things that they're throwing away every day, and also the positive things that they're doing. So remember, we want to think about framing this positively. What are they doing actively to reduce their waste? So what choices did they make in a day to produce less waste overall? You could do goal setting with a teacher, or you could also think about having like a small group situation where they have like almost a support group where they're sharing like the strategies that they have, and trying to encourage each other to reduce their waste more. A modification I thought about for this was to post a picture of one thing that they did to reduce waste every day. So like a picture of themselves like using their refillable water bottle, or putting something in the recycling, or putting something in the compost, and then sharing that with their classmates, kind of encourage them. And again, when we're thinking about where students are in our donut, this is more of a medium to a high affect activity. Students are really looking at their own behaviors and trying to change habits, which students who are really in a panic zone with their situation are not really going to be emotionally capable of doing necessarily. So just keep that in mind with all of these as well.
So Emily, we have a comment that Benita's doing an environmental lunch where students are looking at waste in their lunches that are sent home from school. And she's received great feedback from families from that.
Those are the, just to clarify, the like prepackaged lunches that schools are delivering to families?
There's a whole variety of the kinds of lunches that schools are providing. Yeah.
Yeah. This is, if you've been to the center, you'll know that we do like an ORT program with students where we look at their food waste for their meals. And it's really important to talk about the ways that if students receive free and reduced lunch at school, or a lot of school lunchroom programs in general, really make kids like take everything, even if they're not going to eat it. And the way that that actually trains students to produce more waste overall, because they're literally being taught that like you have to take these things that you're not going to use every single day whenever they eat. And that's really important to acknowledge and think about, and get students to think about as well, the ways that those systems really impact our behaviors. That's really cool.
Vicki has a interesting spin talking to wastewater treatment plant managers to see if there's been more water usage during this distance learning time, and what different things they might be seeing in the water for treatment.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I would be curious to figure out if there are changes in that.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, we've already seen, and I'm sure you guys have seen that as well, reports on environmental conditions changing in situations where most of the population is in quarantine or is under lockdown. And this is a very high affect activity. These are things that you would only want to do with students who are emotionally capable of kind of engaging in this conversation. But thinking about your day in stay at home or in quarantine, and how that is changing your daily habits, and how that might be either encouraging you or discouraging you to reduce your waste. I know personally, like, I'm not driving anywhere, right? So I'm using less energy, I'm producing less waste overall, I'm cooking more at home. Like, all of these things about my daily life have changed. And could we help students almost frame that in a positive way, and thinking about how, while this is really difficult and super challenging and upsetting, is there a silver lining here? Is there some way that we could find comfort in the things that we're doing that are actually being friendlier to our planet as well? And so thinking about a compare and contrast, like a regular school day versus a day with distance learning, what would you guess would be the difference in your waste reduction? And students could either figure this out in like numbers, right? Or they could just do it in a more qualitative way. And also looking at current events and reports coming out of places like LA, where smog is greatly reduced, and all of those things that we're already seeing happening in our environment because people have changed their behavior. And then things that haven't changed, even though people have changed their behavior, and talking about why that might be, or what is going on besides people's individual behavior that is impacting our planet and our waste production. I was also thinking about those silly 5-minute video crafts where they always do that weird upcycling, which always in a non-quarantine situation seemed very silly to me. But you could do an upcycle challenge where students make things out of stuff that they find in their homes, like without going to a store. Could you make something with just stuff that you would otherwise throw away? So making a short video, kind of like a 5-minute craft video, showing something they did with a reused object, and then challenging other students to make it themselves and post a picture of their results. I've seen videos where, like, you take a plastic bottle and you make a bird feeder out of it by cutting holes and filling it with seed, or something really simple like that. I would caution you about those 5-minute craft videos. Like, I would be very careful about showing them to kids because a lot of them are fake and dangerous. But I do think that it's a cute idea, and it could really encourage students to see their waste in a different way, or to think about reusing something rather than recycling it or sending it to a landfill. So when we're thinking about our waste reduction journey, and while I'm talking here, find some time if you want to type in a question or a comment. Once we think about individual growth, we can then start thinking about how can we encourage students in this time to engage in any community action? Could we help them think about this problem on a much larger scale? Often we tend to focus on individual behaviors and habits, when a lot of the actual problems that we're facing are happening on a governmental or corporate really level. And there's not a whole lot that individuals can do necessarily to combat those issues without engaging in community action. So that's where we're going to move next. Did we have any other comments or questions that popped up?
We did. We had one wonder about kids' heartbeats, and see if their heart rate has slowed down. Vicky's saying that hers has slowed down to her normal summer heart rate. So that's a nice way of internalizing, how is this affecting me, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And that would be a really easy thing that any student anywhere could measure at any time. You just need a clock with a second hand on it. That's really cool. It's a neat idea. So you could take all of this and move to an end of the year push to do a reduction challenge. I think that this is where a lot of schools go with their on-site programming with waste reduction, is to have students do a challenge to reduce their waste overall. So you could, I'm going to talk a little bit about framing this as a competition and how to do that sensitively, but you could use class data to do a competition either within the class to lower your class goal, your class waste overall, right, to push yourselves, or you could do it with another class, right, class B class, see who could do the most reduction. When we do this at Osprey Wilds, we do measure when different schools are there at the same time. We measure their ORT separately. So like one school has their own food waste measurement, and then a different school has their own food waste measurement. And I at least have found personally that emphasizing the competition can kind of lead to some unhealthy behaviors among students, particularly like eating out of the garbage, or like policing other students' behavior. And so we've really moved away personally from the competitive model, but you know your students best, and you know what's going to engage them. Some students really respond well to competition and some students really don't. And so if you're thinking about a competition, I would encourage you to think about students competing with themselves, right? Challenging themselves to do better than they did before rather than to defeat other students necessarily. But you also want to think about what is going to increase engagement, what is going to make it fun for kids, because the more these things are fun, the more they're going to do them. But to also make sure that you are doing a debrief about your challenge, you know, and really thinking carefully about what actually gets in the way of these goals, because it's not always individual behavior that gets in the way of achieving these goals. And it's really important to help students kind of acknowledge that and process that, because sometimes you can get feelings of like, well, we only lost because so-and-so threw away so much stuff, you know, and that's not really super healthy for students. And so I just want to, given my own experience of doing this with kids, those are definitely things that come up and things that you want to think about how you're going to address. A modification you could do of this is if you had done, if you had watched like either my video or you had done a high impact waste object research project, you could encourage like a class, almost a boycott of a particular type of product. Like, we're not going to use plastic bottles, or we're not going to buy things that are individually wrapped inside of a package, you know, or whatever you decide. You could decide like, for the rest of the school year, we're not going to use any of these things, and then check in with students daily about how challenging that is, and how difficult it is to get away from those plastic products or those, you know, not biodegradable products, et cetera, et cetera. That would be an interesting way to kind of reframe a reduction challenge as a more specific elimination of a product. You could have students, if you did a virtual tour, or we're looking at wastewater treatment plants or landfills or recovery centers or things like that, research like where their garbage goes. Like, have them find out, okay, so you take your garbage out to the curb, where does it go? Where does your specific garbage go to? And how does your city that you live in manage that? Which is going to be much more present for them as they're staying at home all the time, right? They're going to be seeing those processes happen. They might even be able to see the collectors come and take the garbage away, right? And then you could discuss the pros and cons of those solutions, like what is the benefit of a landfill as opposed to a recovery center, right? And what are the differences that are generated by those different ways of waste management? What's missing in your city's waste management plan? Like, some cities have composting programs and some don't. And then thinking about how could you contact folks with suggestions for changes in your city, or more information about how things are managed, or making presentations to groups about what students found out. And that would be a really interesting way to engage with students across your classes, because they might live in different places and have different cities that they're kind of dealing with, and different waste management programs that they're a part of. And so that could inspire some really interesting discussion among students as well. And this is my last one, I promise. This was a ton. Could you have them talk specifically about school, and what waste they produced at school? How is that different now that they're staying at home? Is there anything that has changed with their staying at home that they would keep, or anything else that they would want to change moving forward? And then write or present a proposal to your administration if they're open to that, or even just to you as the teacher. That's another option that students could do, that might help them feel a little more connected to their school as well, that they're thinking about going back, and thinking about how things are going to be different when they go back, and helping them process those feelings as well. So thinking about doing waste management with students who are learning at home, again, you really want to think about those different steps. Are you going to do awareness, individual growth, community action, all three, 2 out of the 3? And when you make that decision, you really want to know, where are your students at with their personal lives, their own level of stress, their own affect? Are they in their challenge zone, comfort zone, panic zone? And how can you really help design your lessons to really help them either use their daily stress and their changes in a positive way, or really help them feel comforted and safe in their habits, and make sure that you're not really pushing them to do more than they're necessarily emotionally capable of right now. So my goal here was to really just give you a bunch of ideas to build off of. The feedback that I got from the last session was that that was one of the most helpful things. And so I hope that this gives you something to think about, some ideas to just go ahead and take and run with, or to modify, or to build off of. But I also want to build space for folks to share their expertise. I'm just going to check the time. Oh, we're great on time. Because I want to get you out of here at 9, because I want to respect everybody's time. So if you have other suggestions, other applications, modifications of things that I've thought of, go ahead and throw those in the chat. And if you also have questions, I'll stick around and answer questions as well.
So Emily Darcy's shared that she made a lesson for some of her older scholars to adopt a drain in their cities. And they go out and check and clean those drains monthly. And they're researching how this helps their community.
That is awesome. Yeah. And I'm just thinking of the drain that's right outside my house right here. When they're at home all the time, they can definitely, like, you could even have them go every day and check like daily changes or weekly changes as well. That's a great idea. Awesome. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
It's again, that typing takes a little bit of time. So
wait time is so much harder in a digital context.
Really
I'm sure you guys have experienced that.
And we've been trying, for those of you who are on, we've been trying in the Into the Field. If you're not already getting our Into the Field resources, be sure to go on the auduboncharterschools.org website. Addie, maybe you could put that in the chat. And sign up to be part of our listserv, and we'll get that Into the Field out to you. It provides a lot of different resources for folks, specifically related to the adopted drains. In the last issue, there is actually a program that can help you actually identify and claim a drain that you're going to monitor and keep clean. So that's an extension of that. Works in bigger cities for sure. We've had someone who said one of the small things is that students can pick up trash in their area, which certainly folks would normally be doing as a school activity, but now in theory, we can have even greater outreach, right?
They could even measure the waste that they pick up in their neighborhood.
Yeah. Miranda says they've had students research where the water goes when it reaches the drain. So, and Darcy said their students actually did go to the webpage and actually adopted a drain. So great. That's nice to know there was a connection there. Thanks, Darcy.
That's awesome.
Stacy says their 4th graders do water testing at a local river and report as citizen science to, I think it's the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Families can adopt a river or lake in their area too to test and report on. Kits are given out by the MPCA to do the testing.
Yeah, this is a great time to be doing citizen science with your kids if they're capable of doing that. Yeah.
Emily, while we're waiting for other questions, can you think of other citizen science resources that people could tie into?
I know that there is a lot of like water monitoring. I know that we've done that at the center as well. Most of the citizen science that I'm familiar with has more to do with like wildlife, not so much waste reduction, but things like doing bird counts or using even like iNaturalist to record species that you see. This is actually a great time to be like watching for birds because birds are migrating right now. But that's a form of citizen science that kids can engage in without even leaving their homes, just like looking out the window and recording the birds that they're seeing going by. Yeah, most of the citizen science that I've done has been in sandstone, so it's not as easily replicable in the home, I think.
Sure. Continuing on the labeling drains that lead to lakes and rivers. There are maps from the DNR that show ditch flows in different areas of the state to rivers and lakes.
Mm-hmm.
Darcy wanted some clarification on what citizen science there was for rivers. And I believe that if that's referring to Stacy's comment, that was adopt a river or lake from the MPCA.
Mm-hmm. I know what we've done at the center is it's a lot of like taking measurements, like measuring total phosphate, measuring, taking like Secchi readings, or you would do a turbidity reading in a river where you're like measuring the clarity of the water. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they even have you take like wildlife samples, but not as often. It's more like actual water sampling, taking temperatures, things like that to kind of record the overall health and trophic state of the body of water.
So Benita says they've been doing a lot of things. She's learned some new ways of approaching how students continue through our goal throughout the summer. Mm-hmm. She's also a gardener for the school. She's sent home compost buckets for students mm-hmm. to send their families food scraps to benefit the school garden. They go home on the bus and then they come back to school and she empties the compost into the composter, rinses it out and sends the buckets back to families, and it's working great.
That is awesome.
Yeah, Stacy says they did a project where they made sewless bags out of t-shirts. So that's a
sewless. Nice. Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, finding ways to reuse things in a way that's useful. Something else I've been thinking about, which would require like an outdoor space, but you could have students like observe composting or observe decomposition over a series of days, because I think a lot of students don't really know how long it actually takes for things to decompose, but like have them like put something out in their yard and just observe it every day and see how it changes. But that would require access to an outdoor space and some way to shield whatever they put out there from wildlife. But observing decomposition is a really simple way to talk to kids about waste management mm-hmm. as well, because you want to think about, well, did this plastic wrapper decompose or didn't it? Or thinking about how long it actually takes for an item of food to break down. I know a lot of folks will throw food out their car windows because it's like, oh, it's biodegradable. It's like, yeah, but how long does it really take? And how long is it sitting there?
And what wildlife are you attracting to the road?
Exactly.
I don't know. Yeah. I think.
Well, folks, was there one more?
I think things have sort of calmed down.
Yeah, we're just about 9 o'clock. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming out here again, for spending your time here with me. I really, I don't take it lightly. I really wanted to come up with things that you guys could just take and use, and I hope we're inspiring. As always, I really welcome your feedback. So you can always shoot me an email. My email address is just my last name, PORTER, @ospreywilds.org. And you can ask me questions there, or give me feedback, or if you have ideas for other things that you would want to hear about, let me know. And I think that is it. Thanks for being here. Thanks for all the hard work that you do.
Yeah, thanks everyone for taking the time. I love, Emily, your spin on there's some things that we can might even be able to do better in a distance learning environment than we are able to in a seat-based environment. And that's a nice thing to think about, especially as we're arguing through the last few weeks of this distance learning. So thanks for this and for some prompts for some ways that we can do some exciting things here towards the end of the school year that might make a difference. So thanks again, Emily, for your time. Thanks everyone for participating. Like I said, we'll have this video, the slides that Emily produced, and Addie normally puts together a notes page that compiles the things that we had come up in the chat. So those will all be posted on our website. So be sure to look for those, and have a great rest of the day and a great week. Thanks for all you do. Bye.
Thanks again, everyone.